agenda is set. I'm Brent Goff in Berlin. It's time to talk. Under attack, not only in war zones, today a global report on the state of human rights. Free to surf as long as you pay. Is net neutrality a relic of web history? And a warning from Davos, the gap between rich and poor, now democracy's biggest threat. Well, welcome to the show, everyone. I've invited three people today to talk, argue, and pry apart these headlines. We are moving into an era of extremes, just as the leaders meeting at Davos this week are warning. That is what Ferdinand Fichtner from the German Institute for Economic Research thinks. Ferdinand, it's good to have you on the show with us today.
Good morning.
The internet's golden age is over. If Edward Snowden didn't convince you, then just watch what Iran and China are planning. That's according to Falk Steiner. He is co-author of the book, The Digital Society, a layman's guide to what internet freedom means for everyone. A repeat here on Agendas. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Again, Falk. And my next guest is considered one of the global monitors of human rights. He is in Berlin this week to release the much-anticipated 2014 report on human rights. I am happy to welcome to the show Kenneth Roth. He's the executive director of Human Rights Watch. Ken, it's good to have you on the show. Before we start talking about this report, I want to get your reaction to this report that has just come out from The Guardian and CNN on possible proof of incredible atrocities in Syria. What do you say about the photos that have been posted?
Yeah, well, these photos, I don't know if all your viewers have seen them, but they are thousands of gruesome photos of dead people, who many emaciated, many showing signs of torture, all of whom allegedly had been in Syrian custody and executed, thousands of them. And we had heard about these photos for some time now. They now have come out. Human Rights Watch has not been able to look at them personally to authenticate them. But assuming that they are accurate and genuine, they represent crimes against humanity of just unthinkable proportions.
I mean, this is an indictment against the Assad regime. How should this be a factor? What kind of factor should this be in the Syrian peace talks?
Well, this gets into actually the Human Rights Watch report today, because really our lead thesis there is that as the Geneva II peace talks open this week, everybody hopes for peace. We all realize that these talks are nowhere near succeeding. It's going to take months and months and months, if they ever arrive at a peace solution and a transitional government. The real question is, in the meantime, what is going to be done about the mass atrocities being committed in Syria? Because it's important to remember that the Assad government is not simply shooting at the combatants on the other side. Assad's war strategy is a strategy of war crimes. He is deliberately trying to kill as many civilians as possible in opposition-held areas as a way of turning the population against the rebels, as an effort to depopulate those zones. So he is indiscriminately bombing cities. He's depriving these areas of humanitarian aid. This has to be a parallel focus in Geneva. Okay. If it isn't, if we just sort of kick it down the road and say peace will solve everything, there will be many, many needless deaths before then.
Yeah, we're going to talk about how we put Syria into the Human Rights Watch report for 2014. The civil war in Syria, the persecution of gays in Uganda, protests over police brutality in Brazil and Turkey. Those are just some of the topics that we have put on the agenda here in the past year. Now, unfortunately, there are always more stories about human rights abuses to report than time allows. Well, this week, one of the most important barometers on human rights is being made public right here in Berlin, the 2014 Human Rights Watch report on human rights.
A major concern highlighted in the new Human Rights Watch annual review is the civil war in Syria, where both sides of the conflict have targeted civilians. The report blames the West for failing to exert enough pressure to stop atrocities and get adequate humanitarian aid to millions of people trapped or displaced by the conflict. By contrast, the report refers to a vibrant response by the international community to human rights abuses in the Central African Republic and other war-torn African countries. Another issue raised in the report is the US government's mass surveillance of electronic communications. Under the guise of counter-terrorism, it has affected privacy around the world.
What is the situation of human rights in the beginning of 2014 compared to a year ago?
Well, it's impossible to make these year-to-year comparisons because the world is a big place. You've got to look country by country. But, as the trailer you just showed illustrates, the big disappointment of the year was the failure to make any progress in stopping the deliberate mass killing of civilians in Syria. We did have the chemical weapons deal. That was good. But chemical weapons have been responsible for fewer than 2% of the deaths in Syria. 98% of the deaths, more than that, are caused by conventional weapons. And that is really not so far on the agenda in Geneva too. John Kerry has not wanted to bring up difficult issues for fear that one party or the other might not come to Geneva. And this is not the way to address the war. By all means, try to negotiate a peace, but parallel with that has to be a sincere effort to stop the mass atrocities, to open the borders to the influx of humanitarian aid, to address the real suffering of the Syrian people.
When you talk like that, though, obviously most people are going to say that human rights in the world have actually gotten worse than they were a year ago. And I'll pull everyone in here. Is that the feeling, at least, that we have right now, that 2014 we're worse off than we were in 2013?
At least it feels like it hasn't gotten better. So I think that's the main thing. So because, when we're looking at Syria, when we're looking at Egypt, when we're looking at many other places in the world, we all feel, at least I do, that human rights are still, not very well established yet. Mm-hmm. And, when we're looking at the Western world as well, so for example, the NSA scandal has shown us that some kinds of human rights, at least, are not in place that well, even in the US. And not in the Western world. Yeah, in the U.S., we're going to pick up on that in just a second. Fernand, what do you say?
I would agree in principle. I don't know if I would focus on last year or on this year. I would say there appears to be a deterioration somehow over the last few years. Maybe we're talking more about 2 or 3 years. It's probably not calendar years human rights care about. That's probably also what you mentioned. But in principle, there appears to be a deterioration of human rights and an increase of tensions from a global perspective, talking about the Arab Spring, talking about tensions in Brazil, in the Middle East, which appear to somehow damage the foundations of societies.
There clearly is lots of bad news to talk about, but maybe I should just begin by highlighting some things that went relatively well in this last year. The so-called responsibility to protect, the doctrine that the international community has a duty to stop mass atrocities. While it failed big time in Syria, it actually was applied reasonably well in the Central African Republic, which you just mentioned, also in South Sudan, in Eastern Congo. In each of those cases, the international community did mobilize fairly quickly to stop mass atrocities. If you look at the UN...
How do you explain that, too? How do you explain we're seeing this mobility so quickly in Africa, and yet when it comes to Syria, basically no action?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it is that Syria is much more complicated, a much more formidable military in Assad. And it also, in a sense, the Syrian people suffered from blowback for the perception that in Libya, NATO went beyond protecting civilians and moved to regime change. That broad perception led many governments to be reluctant to support tougher action in Syria. And so the Syrian people have suffered as a consequence. But even if you look at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, it has responded fairly effectively this year to the incredible totalitarian repression in North Korea, to the fact that Sri Lanka, nothing has been done to look at the government's responsibility for 40,000 deaths of civilians in the waning months of the war with the Tamil Tigers. So there have been steps forward. But if you look at, one of the trends we highlight in the report is the rise of what we call abusive majoritarianism. That is, governments...
That's the phrase that is in the report, yeah.
Yes. And
what does that mean?
What it means is that there have been a series of instances in which governments either have an electoral mandate or simply claim to be acting on behalf of the majority, but then operate without the restraints that any genuine democracy would require.
You're describing Egypt.
Absolutely. Egypt is example number one. So even with the Muslim Brotherhood, they operated without regard to minority rights. They tried to put themselves above the law, whereas being subject to the rule of law is a key element of a democracy. It's then much, much worse under the military-dominated government, where they have, basically arrested thousands of Muslim Brotherhood activists and leaders. They killed over 1,000 demonstrators. All of this in the name of, there wasn't even an election. They just claimed to be acting for the majority because there were demonstrations in the street. And you see, less severe parallels of this in Prime Minister Erdogan's actions in Turkey in response to the protests there. You see it in Kenya, where President Kenyatta says, I got my 51%, therefore we should stop the prosecution of my alleged involvement in the post-electoral killings of 2007, 2008. You see it in Thailand, where the Prime Minister has tried to use her electoral majority to amnesty her brother from corruption charges. There have been a series of cases like this.
These are all, it all sounds like what you're describing are these empty promises of democracy, too. We talked a lot on this show in the past 2 years about the promises of the Arab Spring and what comes with democracy. And a lot of people who sat at this table said that the protection of human rights, respect for human rights, will be one of the best byproducts of the Arab Spring. But that is exactly what we have not seen.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that human rights don't just come automatically. They have to be one element of democracy. So, elections are a pillar, but you also need respect for human rights and the rule of law. And if you don't have those three pillars, the democracy collapses. It's not a real democracy. Now, if you want a bit of good news out of the Arab Spring, probably the only good news there is, you can look at Tunisia, where, unlike the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, unlike the Egyptian military, there hasn't been this winner-take-all approach. Rather, there's been genuine compromise built around a constitution that now is emerging, which does largely respect rights. Now, obviously, a constitution is just a piece of paper. You need to ensure that it's respected. In Egypt, they just adopted a decent constitution and are flouting it day in and day out.
Right.
But Tunisia,
there's no guarantee.
No, but Tunisia's been, just the way the actors have behaved there has been much less winner-take-all, much more willing to operate within the constraints of human rights. And that's what you look for when you're trying to construct a democracy.
We are, just weeks away now from Sochi, the Olympic Games there. What's your report's take on Russia?
Well, Russia is going through the worst crackdown since the Soviet era. This is very much a product of Putin's insecurity, really. He was terrified by the large-scale protests after the parliamentary elections and the presidential election. There was a significant segment of Russian society that was not happy to see Putin back in the driver's seat. He has responded by trying to ban demonstrations, by tarring NGOs, by scapegoating gays with this new anti-homosexual propaganda law, much of this appealing to his conservative base. Now, the good news in all this is that his reaction over the last few weeks shows that he does care about public opinion. There was so much criticism of this crackdown in advance of Sochi that he recognized that Sochi was going to be a PR disaster if he didn't start acting.
So he's pulling back.
So he released Khodorkovsky, he released the Pussy Riot women, he released the environmental activists. But what's important to recognize is he hasn't changed any of the repressive laws.
Yeah, and exactly. The laws haven't been changed. I mean, it's just PR window dressing, what we've seen from the Kremlin, correct?
Obviously, if you're Khodorkovsky, it's not just window dressing. But it is, what it shows is that Putin is attentive to his image. He cares about his reputation. And that means that there is a reason for the West to be tough. If you look at this from the German perspective, the old Ostpolitik approach in which you make nice to Putin and hope he behaves better, that's been totally discredited. It clearly didn't work. And what I think is interesting is that the new German foreign minister, Steinmeier, has suddenly been much more outspoken about Ukraine now that Ukraine has started to adopt Putin-style tactics. The big question is, will he carry that over to Russia?
Yeah, and I want to ask, are Germans on the panel here too? Has Germany done enough in criticizing Putin and Russia on its human rights record?
Well, in my opinion, it clearly hasn't. But you were talking of the new foreign minister, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, but the new coordinator for the German-Russian relationship, Gernot Eller, he's a very old friend of Russia and in particular of the now ruling regime in Russia. So I'm not sure whether it will really change to the extent you would like to see it.
The big question is, how influential will he be? Or will Steinmeier, who's a thoughtful individual, will he recognize that Ostpolitik was for a different era? And that today, Putin has shown himself so committed to a repressive path that a more vigorous public approach, more greater criticism, is the appropriate thing for Germany to do.
We're running out of time here, but we have to get to our next topic. But there are two other topics I want to talk with you before we move on. And that is, you mentioned gays. I want to talk about that, and also surveillance. That's been a big issue.
Also in Russia.
Also in Russia. But this notion of gays, we have very draconian laws that we're seeing in Nigeria, Uganda, and as you mentioned, in Russia. How do you force the conversation globally that gay rights should be protected as human rights when you have heads of state all over the world saying gay rights are not human rights?
Well, what happens is you have, some governments that defend gay rights, others that don't. The ones that don't, they tend to use this dodge. They say, homosexuality, that's a Western imposition, as if, gays were airdropped into Nigeria or Uganda and they never existed there.
But that's what they're saying, though, Ken. They're saying that it's the Western white man's plague that is being dropped into Africa.
Yeah. Well, which
and
is actually,
their constituents are believing that.
Well, some believe it, but we all know it's crazy. I mean, there are gays and lesbians in every country, every place. And our view is that this is not a Western imposition. They're gays every place. This is a governmental imposition on the people of their society. It's the government there saying, we are not going to let you gays, you lesbians, live the lives you want to lead because we're going to impose our conservative values on you. This is not a Western imposition. This is a local governmental imposition. It's important to demonstrate that and to basically stand in solidarity with the gays and lesbians of these countries who just want to lead their lives.
And is that the only way that this conversation can be forced? Because we're talking about convincing people that the list of human rights has to be lengthened in their minds. There's no agreement globally that gay rights are human rights. I mean, how do you get people to open up and say, well, we will include gays and lesbians in this list?
Well, it's the same process we have to go through to defend women's rights in some countries, where they say, what are you talking about, women's rights? We have a traditional society. Women play a subordinate role. And the only way to work in a place like that is to work with the local activists, the women or the gays or the lesbians who want equality. They want to be able to lead lives the same way as everybody else, and to stand with them to use the pressure that's available to us to build pressure within that society for gradual change. And we've seen it work in many places. But it's a battle. You don't expect linear progress here. Sometimes it goes forward, sometimes it goes backwards.
You are announcing the 2014 Human Rights Watch report here in Berlin this year.
Yes.
Is there a reason why you chose Berlin this year?
Well, one obvious factor in all of this is that Berlin has emerged as what you might say is the epicenter of the reaction to the NSA overreaching in its electronic surveillance. And one of the major topics that we do touch on in the report is this massive invasion of our right to privacy. Now, President Obama gave an interesting speech on Friday, but it didn't go nearly far enough. I think most important, he still takes the view that this mass scooping up of the data from our electronic communications does not invade our privacy, that our privacy is only implicated when the government looks at or listens to that information. And that's crazy. I mean, the analogy that I tend to use is that imagine that the government put a video camera in your bedroom and said, this feed is going right into a government computer, but don't worry, we won't look at it unless we have a special reason.
Right.
That's basically what the U.S. philosophy is.
That's that's an interesting prospect for a lot of people, right?
That's right.
That idea.
But what Obama said is, we won't keep it in the government computer anymore. We'll create a new institution and put it in that computer. Yeah. That doesn't save anything. So there's no recognition that our privacy rights are implicated when the government collects the information. And even in other areas, he said we're going to be a little bit more careful in looking at that information, a little bit more careful in listening to the conversations of non-Americans outside the United States or reading their emails. But there's no recognition at all that there is a right of privacy involved in these areas.
And the U.S. is completely off script when it's talking to the Germans about this notion, right, Phil?
It definitely is, because in Germany you have a totally different approach to privacy. So when it comes to data protection, you see it as a fundamental right, but to some extent, they're using the same arguments sometimes. For example, in the US, you don't have a privacy right for foreigners at all, and you can't challenge the law over there. And exactly the same applies for the German so-called G10 law, which is more or less like strategic telecommunications surveillance law. And you have exactly the same. You have the same that you have no rights for foreigners, but many rights for citizens of Germany in this case. So just like the FISA in the US, it's pretty similar. at least in this regard.
I have to say, I mean, this is it's an anachronism. In other words, this narrow view of privacy, that it only applies to, basically your citizens, or they take it a step further and say foreigners in your country it applies to, but not foreigners outside your country. That, comes from an era where governments couldn't really exert power outside of their boundaries. But today, with the internet, where telecommunications are going all over the place and they're regularly passing through other countries, to say that the government has no duty to the people whose conversations or emails happen to pass through their territory is not a reflection of reality today. The laws have to be updated. And now Germany, with Brazil, has taken the initiative at the UN General Assembly and is pushing an effort to create new international standards in this area.
Okay.
The U.S. is fighting back. But what was adopted at the General Assembly was a good step forward, and I hope will lead to more modernized privacy standards.
Very briefly, because I'm being told we have to move on. Very briefly, Berlin, a mecca for whistleblowers. Can you imagine Edward Snowden moving to Berlin, being granted amnesty? Do you want to see that?
Well, he can go wherever he wants, in my view. He is a whistleblower. I think it's important to recognize that. And Obama in his speech went out of his way to denounce
You don't think he's going to get clemency in the United States?
Well, I mean, not under Obama, because he doesn't want to get attacked from the right. But, the irony is, here's Obama denouncing Snowden still, but he never would have been given this speech. He never would have put this reform.
Had it not been for Snowden.
Had it not been for Snowden, exactly.
All right. Well, is it the end of the internet as we know it? Net neutrality supporters will tell you yes, indeed. Last week, a U.S. federal appeals court struck down segments of the FCC's open internet rules. Now, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, that's the U.S. telecommunications regulator. The court determined that the FCC does not have the power to require internet service providers to treat all traffic equally. My email, the movie that you downloaded, the iTunes song that you just bought, the FCC says it should be able to move on the net, all of it, equally. Well, not anymore.
Last week's U.S. court decision against the government body that regulates internet traffic is being seen as a blow to net neutrality. The ruling could mean that internet service providers would be able to discriminate against different kinds of traffic, giving premium access and bandwidth to favored customers and slowing down or blocking others. Some digital activists say it could spell the end to the free flow of information on the web. That, along with concerns about online surveillance in the wake of the NSA spying scandal, has led many to fear the golden age of the internet is over.
Is that true, Falf? The golden age is over?
Well, it depends a little bit on what you define as a golden age, because we have seen a lot of, misleading things, misleading paths for the internet in the past 20 years already. But of course, I think the way we were using the internet, the way we were putting our hopes into the internet or onto the internet, both of it, I think that's the past now. That's part of the past, and this won't come back anymore. I think we're going to work much more critical with the internet and have a much more critical view on the internet.
Let me do a flash poll at the table here, which I love to do. Let me ask all three of you. All three of you have smartphones, correct? We all have smartphones.
Yes.
Does anyone here have a unlimited data plan on their phone?
I think so.
Yeah.
You do?
You think so, but you don't know.
No, but can you say you have
Yes.
one? But how long have you had that plan? A long time.
A long time, yeah.
Right, exactly. I mean, no one buying a plan today can get unlimited data without paying through the wazoo. Some providers don't even offer that anymore. Isn't that proof, Falk, that the golden age is over?
Well, to be honest, you have to distinguish a little bit between mobile networks, which are not classical internet by themselves,
But
by
that's
definition.
where we're spending more and more of our time on the internet.
So that's part of the problem. But it's not exactly the same as, for example, fiber internet or copper internet, so DSL or whatever technique you're using. So I think you have to differentiate a little bit between both techniques. So what you were sold, which was called internet, mobile internet, never was internet, to be fair. So that's not the same as what you know as internet from landline connections, whatever. So if we take a look at both techniques, they're merging, but until now at least, they're not the same. So when we are talking about internet, we mainly talk about landline internet. When we're talking about mobile, we're talking about something like AOL, to be honest, or CompuServe in its very early days. So that's not the same technique, and you can't compare it that much. But when we're talking about net neutrality, you already see where the landline internet is also heading to. And that's exactly where we are already with the mobile companies. So, for example, you're not allowed to use some software, mainly voice over IP software, without paying an extra fee for that. And I think that's where we are heading to in the landline world as well now, in particular after this lovely FCC, after the FCC was losing the decision of the appeals court in D.C.
So, what impact is that going to have globally? I mean, is it going to have impact globally?
I think it is, because the FCC was trying to do something which was unprecedented in the world before. They were setting rules for the providers, how they are transporting data on the internet. And I think that's something which was never challenged before in court, at least not in Europe. And now Verizon Wireless has exactly done that. And, well, they won. So they are free to do whatever they want to the data. To charge more, but also to discriminate against some kind of traffic if they want to.
Yeah, and Ferdinand, I mean, you're the economist here at the table. What's that going to mean for poorer people? Aren't we seeing the creation of haves and have-nots in the internet world? People who can afford fast traffic and people who can't.
Probably yes. On the other hand, as an economist, I would first say, why shouldn't we? We have this difference between the possibilities for the poor on the one hand and the possibilities for the rich. We have it in all areas of life. So why should it be different on the internet? And it's not entirely clear. I don't want to be a proponent of net inequality or net differences, so to say. But at first sight, it's not fully clear to me why it shouldn't be possible for internet firms or ISPs to differentiate in terms of the quality of service they provide. I mean, it has been around for years.
Yeah, but I'll tell you why they shouldn't be able to. We're always describing the internet, we're comparing the internet with the library. And anyone can get a library card, and you can check out anything at the library. No one asks you how much money you make. So why shouldn't it be the same for the internet, Mr. Economist?
Well, the thing is that it should be the same. It should not be the same because the library is a highly subsidized institution typically, right? So libraries don't have to make money out of their business, as opposed to Verizon, for example. Verizon wants to earn money. If you want Verizon, sorry, if you want the internet to be public like a library, you have to provide public institutions. You need public institutions which provide this service. Then we can discuss about this. As I said, I understand that it's kind of the founding myth of the internet to be equal and to provide all opportunities to everybody.
I want to pull Kenan on this. I mean, am I trying to turn access to the internet into a human right, into a basic right for everybody?
Well, access to the internet should be a human right for everyone. This is the key method of modern communication today. And when you see governments that try to deny access to the internet by taking away people's email or social media accounts, that is a human rights violation. It's basically a violation of the right to free expression. Now, in this area, what we're talking about is, is it a violation for a private company to charge a little bit more to offer a little bit faster service on the internet? Maybe not, as long as there is viable service for everybody else. And that for me is the bottom line.
You mean like a basic package, the same way cable companies do with television? They offer a basic package that guarantees a certain number of channels. I mean,
think of it in terms of a dissident in China who wants to spread the message and has no money. They should have viable access to the internet so they can do that. If this differentiation becomes such inferior service for the ordinary user that they don't have effective access, that becomes a problem. But if they do have effective access and you're just getting some premium service for a little extra money, that becomes less of a concern.
Okay, you mentioned the dissident in China. That takes us into another realm of net neutrality, and that is the notion of countries creating their own internets, closing off their borders.
Well, that is a particular concern now because of the NSA. In other words, we're all talking about the NSA invading our privacy, which is a big deal. But what I fear is that you will see many countries saying, aha, we can't trust the United States anymore, so you're not allowed to repatriate any user data back to the United States. The primary tactic that Western internet companies have used in China to avoid having to turn over user information to the Chinese government so that they can arrest people who say the wrong thing is by keeping the user information outside of China. But if the consequence of the NSA overreaching is that China feels justified in saying, no, don't send anything back to the United States, it's going to be easier for China to learn the identity of dissidents who are using the internet.
We even had that suggestion here in Germany when the NSA revelations, when all of that came to light. There were even politicians here in Germany saying that Europe should create its own internet.
Well, it's not creating its own internet. To be honest, we first have to explain a little bit how the internet works, because it's called internet, which means it's a connection of different networks. So the interconnection. So it's interconnected networks, and it means we have different providers in all over the world who are connecting to each other, and by that building the whole internet.
But this discussion is talking about building walls, though, correct?
Well, to more or less to interfere with the protocols behind the internet, to change the way data is routing around the world. So, and the German vision, to some extent, is to create something called Schengen-net, so named after this infamous Schengen agreement
here in Europe, which allows people to move across borders without being checked.
But only within this area. Right. So, this Schengen-net idea is more or less like keeping the UK and the US out of it and let data move freely within that part of the net, and trying to avoid that it's going to the UK or to the US.
How practical is that, the fact of us actually seeing that?
Well, to some extent it is practical. I think you can manage to have most of the traffic stay inside Germany, or at least staying inside this Schengen area, so whoever is participating in that then. But at least some parts of the traffic have to go somewhere else. For example, if you're using Google, so of course you will connect to a Google server somewhere inside Europe, but this will also be reconnecting with a Google server in Mountain View in the US or somewhere else. So you can't really keep the data inside Europe by creating a Schengen net. Yeah. The only thing you can do is avoiding data to cross through that well-known Tempora project by the GCHQ, so the British intelligence service, which is more or less storing everything going through the UK.
Okay, we got to move on very quickly. Yes or no? Net neutrality, a relic of the past?
To some extent, yes.
All right, good. Well, another topic with numbers that are shocking, and yet they probably don't really surprise a lot of you. Ahead of the World Economic Forum beginning in Davos, Switzerland this week, Oxfam has released a report that shows the world's 85 richest people are as wealthy as the poorest half of the entire population of the planet. Now, put that in pictures for you. The richest people on the planet could fit into a double-decker bus. They would be as wealthy as the poorest 3.5 billion people put together. Now, the situation is not getting better, and it brings with it all kinds of social and political dangers. And this year, it is top of the agenda in Davos.
Income inequality is one of the biggest global risks in the next decade, according to a report ahead of this year's World Economic Forum. Based on the views of 700 experts, the report says low-wage work and unemployment in the wake of the financial crisis is squeezing the middle class in many countries. It says the growing gap between the earnings of the richest and the poorest fuels social unrest in developed and emerging economies. Political and business leaders are gathering for the annual World Economic Forum in Davos. Will this year's Talkfest in the exclusive Swiss resort find a solution to the pressing problem of the income divide?
What is the solution, Ferdinand?
I think there is no solution, to be fair. I think that might in part be due to a temporary phase we're in right now. We have a strong catch-up of emerging economies like China and Brazil seen over the last years in terms of aggregate income, but those economies are not that far as, for example, some industrialized countries in terms of redistributing incomes. So we're seeing a strong divergence of income, mostly in those emerging economies, and this leads to an aggregate income or a global income diversion. And maybe it's just a temporary phase. Yeah, a temporary phase.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate, and Oxfam is probably going to want to shoot me for saying this, but maybe it's actually good that this disparity exists right now, because we're seeing huge economies such as China, Brazil, Russia, India, these economies that are rushing to become developed countries. And your premise is that when you have economies that are rushing to become like the U.S., like Europe, you're going to have these big gaps because the economies are not situated where they can redistribute as well as the West can right now. So it is temporary, and maybe it's a sign that things are developing in a good way. You agree with that?
I agree hesitantly with that, because then we're talking about China, we're talking about Brazil, and we're talking maybe about Mexico. What we're not talking about is Africa, which is not approaching, which is not converging to like Western living standards or industrialized like emerged economies and advanced economies. So in a way, if we're looking just at China and other emerging economies, we probably have to accept that in this convergence phase, in this temporary phase, that there are imbalances inside the countries. And
would you put South Africa into that group as well?
Probably,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah. So we have to accept it as a temporary effect of convergence. But if we look at the rest of Africa and some parts of Africa where we see the strongest tensions are affected by extreme income divergences, I think that's not fair to accept as an
Yeah, but we
argument.
wouldn't put a South Sudan in the same basket as South Africa, would we?
No, we certainly wouldn't. We have the South Sudan, we have Mali, we have all those tension countries in Africa which completely dropped off the table, if you like. We have emerging economies like China, like South Africa, like Mexico, like Brazil, which are actually converging in terms of aggregate incomes to industrialized countries, to advanced economies. And there I would accept that income differences are increasing because it's simply the outflow of this convergence, and those countries are simply not that far in terms of their political institutions in order to create a social security system. But this is it's just a part of the picture.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got to say, I take a very different view of this. And when I see statistics like this, I don't look at simply the tiny percentage at the top. I ask, why are so many people at the bottom so poor? And there are various reasons for that. Some of it is, mass atrocities, turmoil, war, because, when you look at these gross statistics, it includes the people of South Sudan or Central African Republic who can't earn a living right now because they're fleeing for their lives. Part of it is corruption. When you have corrupt people taking away money in, say, a country like Nigeria, which should be relatively wealthy, but has massive poverty because a handful of people siphon off a lot of the wealth. But even in a place like, let's say, like China or Bangladesh, much of the problem is lack of power on the part of workers to negotiate decent wages. And that's because governments suppress labor unions. They suppress the ability of workers to use their natural economic power to seek better salaries. So if you start addressing these causes of impoverishment, you begin to sort of change the picture for the bottom half of the world. And it's not simply a matter of governments redistributing money. It's a matter of creating the conditions in which people can, on their own, earn better salaries.
You're going to Davos. You're going to be in Davos this week.
Yes.
Charles Schwab, who founded the World Economic Forum,
Yes.
was interviewed this week, and he was asked, what about the fact that we still have so many people who are living in poverty, who can't even make it on $2 a day?
Right.
And his answer was, well, if you look at the past 30 years, millions and millions, hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. So he says the story is good. The story is not negative.
Yeah.
I mean, if he says that to you in Davos this week, what are you going to say to him?
Well, there's an element of truth to that, in that simply economic growth has brought people out of poverty. And the biggest part of that equation is China, where you went from massive poverty to much of the nation becoming middle class. That's simply economic growth. My response, though, is it's not enough to settle for that, because even given that economic growth, we have many more people in poverty than should be because of the inability to form trade unions, because of corruption, because of repression. And so you can't just be complacent and say, aha, economic growth has solved everything, trickle down will do everything we need. You've got to also look at the structural conditions that, despite that economic growth, are keeping so many in poverty.
And aren't we more sensitive to the situation of these people being in poverty now, Falk, because we know about it and they know how well we have it thanks to things like the internet?
Well, in the poorest countries, they don't even have internet access most of the time, but in some countries they have. They can tell us their stories. So, of course, we are more aware of that, but only if we want to listen to. So it's our choice if we want to listen to or not. So we can be more aware of their problems, but in fact, most of us are not, because we're just not listening to.
So we're not listening to each other.
We are not listening to each other, and we are not listening to, for example, if somebody in South Sudan is tweeting something, well, it's not that I'm sitting there and waiting for somebody from South Sudan, well, what he's writing. So at least I'm not doing that all the time. Sometimes I do, if I want to, but it's not, well, retweeted into my timeline automatically. You know?
Okay.
I don't think it's just a matter of Twitter. In other words, because of the revolution in electronic communications, we know what's going on in South Sudan.
Yeah.
A century ago, it would take months for us to learn. It wouldn't be on our agenda.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, in that sense, I think there is greater awareness, which could theoretically create the political will to address this problem.
Let me ask Ferdinand, because we're running out of time. What about the situation, though, in rich countries like the U.S. or here in Europe, where the gap between rich and poor continues to grow? What's the solution there?
I think it's exactly the same story. We are not so much seeing an income divergence from a global perspective in terms of if we compare country by country. What we're seeing is a divergence inside the countries, which makes things much more complicated because it creates tensions like we're seeing in the Arab Spring or maybe also in Brazil.
And it's alarming in a country like the United States,
exactly,
right?
And we have to do something about this. It's also the case in industrialized countries, not so much in European countries, and in particular not so much in Northern European countries.
But even here in Germany, you hear people talking about there are more and more poor people.
We have increasing divergences in terms of income, and we have to do something about this. You can discuss minimum wages, you can discuss social minimum standards, also from a global perspective. So I don't want to be complacent about this situation. I don't want to take this as an exit, as an easy exit to say it's a temporary thing. We can do something about this, but it still can be a temporary thing. What I just want to say is we cannot forget Africa and the least developed countries, where even social minimum standards wouldn't help at all because they simply don't have a working economic model for their economies. And I think that's the major problem we are seeing globally.
And Ken is our man here at the table. He was headed to Davos after the show. And do you think we're going to get any type of concrete solution to this problem of income inequality? Because WEF, World Economic Forum, says it's the biggest threat to global stability in 2014.
Well, first of all, don't look to Davos to come up with definitive answers. That's not what Davos is. Davos is a talk shop. People get together and chat about things.
So the answer is no.
Not there, but there are solutions that we can begin to enact over the next year.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming on the show today. That's going to wrap up our agenda. Keep the conversation going on Twitter and Facebook. Tell me what you think about the show today. You can find me on Facebook, and you can tweet me at Brent Goff TV, or use the hashtag DW Agenda. And if you want to watch the show again, you can go to dw.de or watch us on YouTube. I'm Brent Goff in Berlin. Join me next time when I set the agenda.